What if the place where human history truly began is the one we are least allowed to imagine? There are absences in the historical record that feel heavier than missing pages, gaps that do not merely suggest loss, but something closer to erasure. Antarctica sits at the edge of these silences, vast, white, treated as inert, and yet, again and again, it appears, quietly, at the margins of old maps, ancient myths, and unresolved geological questions. And, before you let your body sink fully into this moment of rest, take a very small pause to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what is being whispered here makes you feel like staying a little longer. If you wish, share where and when you are listening. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting together tonight. History tells its story as a steady outward expansion, small groups becoming villages, villages growing into cities, cities learning to call themselves civilizations. The narrative flows northward, eastward, westward, rarely south, almost never to the end of the world. Antarctica, in this telling, arrives only at the end of time, discovered late, useful to no one, claimed reluctantly, studied carefully, and kept at a distance, a continent without memory. Yet there is an unease in how neatly this conclusion is delivered. When historians speak of beginnings, they tend to speak of warmth, rivers, fertility, predictable seasons. The idea that a polar landmass, now locked under kilometres of ice, could have once played a central role feels instinctively wrong, and still, the Earth itself refuses to fully agree. Ice cores reveal climates that do not belong to the present. Geological strata whisper of landscapes shaped by flowing water. Fossil pollen appears where no plant could survive today. These are not declarations, they are murmurs. There was a time, not unimaginably long ago in geological terms, when Antarctica was not the frozen void we see now. It drifted, slowly, patiently, carried by tectonic plates indifferent to future civilizations. Its position relative to the sun was different. Its climate responded. Forests once grew where research stations now hum quietly against the cold. This much is not controversial. What remains unresolved is what, or who, might have lived there during those windows of habitability. The discomfort begins when time frames overlap in unexpected ways. Modern humans are said to have emerged roughly 200,000 years ago, civilizations much later. And yet, Antarctica's last ice-free periods stretch into ranges that brush uncomfortably close to human prehistory. Close enough to provoke questions that rarely make it into textbooks. Questions about movement, about memory, about whether the idea of a single, linear cradle of civilization is more assumption than fact. Ancient maps complicate this further, though they do so without explanation. Certain cartographic works, produced centuries before Antarctica's official discovery, depict a southern landmass with coastlines eerily free of ice. Rivers appear. Mountain ranges align with what radar would only confirm hundreds of years later. The source material for these maps is unknown. The map makers themselves often claim they were copying far older works, inherited, not invented. It is tempting to dismiss this as coincidence, projection, or error, and perhaps it is. But dismissal too is a choice, a way of protecting a structure already built. What is rarely asked is why the possibility unsettles so deeply. Why the suggestion of an ancient southern centre feels more threatening than the idea of lost cities beneath deserts or jungles. Perhaps because Antarctica cannot be easily excavated. It resists storytelling. It demands technology, cooperation, permission. It does not yield itself to casual curiosity. In mythology, the idea of a lost centre appears again and again. A place of origin that fell, sank, burned, or froze. A world before the present one. These stories are often treated as symbolic, moral, or purely imaginative. Yet symbols tend to gather around shared anxieties. around events too large to be remembered directly. If a catastrophic shift occurred, rapid enough to disrupt climate, coastlines, and habitability, it would not only destroy cities, it would scramble knowledge, scatter survivors, force adaptation in fragments. What follows would look, from a distance, like a new beginning, but it would not be one. From this perspective, Antarctica does not need to have been a city of stone or an empire of towers. It only needs to have been central in a way we no longer recognize, a geographic anchor, a climatic stabilizer, a reference point for navigation, myth, or timekeeping. Its loss would not require conspiracy, only ice, time, and the human tendency to rebuild without looking back too far. There is another quiet tension here. Modern governance treats Antarctica as neutral, preserved, untouchable. No nation owns it. No permanent population is allowed. Research is permitted but carefully bounded. This is often framed as enlightened stewardship, and it may be. Yet neutrality can also function as silence, as a way of agreeing not to ask certain questions too loudly. The deeper one listens, the more the pattern repeats. Absence where something should be. Certainty delivered too smoothly. Curiosity redirected towards safer ground. If the original centre of human civilization was not destroyed, but simply displaced, shifted out of reach by climate and time, then history is not incomplete by accident. It is incomplete by design, though not necessarily by intent. Systems remember what they can use. They forget what they cannot verify. Antarctica waits at the edge of this forgetting, not as proof, not as revelation, but as a reminder that the map we use to orient ourselves may already be missing its middle. And if that is true, then the question is no longer whether something was lost beneath the ice, but how many other centres have already slipped from view, unnoticed, as the world quietly rearranged itself. Something about the ice does not behave like an ending. It behaves more like a cover. In the previous movement of this story, Antarctica appeared not as a place of answers, but as a place where questions refuse to remain buried. Now the focus drifts closer, not towards cities or artifacts, but toward the ice itself. Because ice, despite its stillness, is not silent. It accumulates, it layers, it remembers. Modern science treats Antarctic ice as a geological archive, each layer compressed over thousands of years, trapping air, dust, volcanic ash, pollen, a slow, patient ledger of planetary conditions. And within this frozen memory, the story of Antarctica becomes more complex than a simple descent into cold. Ice cores extracted from deep beneath the surface reveal fluctuations that do not align with the idea of an eternally frozen continent. There were intervals, extended ones, when temperatures rose, when ice retreated, when sunlight lingered longer across exposed land. These were not brief anomalies, they were climates, stable enough to support ecosystems, long enough to leave biological traces that do not belong to a polar desert. This is not speculation, it is measurement, isotopes, ratios, chemical signatures that cannot lie, even if interpretation hesitates. Yet here the tension emerges, because while geology allows for warmth, history remains reluctant to allow for presence. The assumption is subtle but persistent, that even if Antarctica was once habitable, it was simply empty, too distant, too isolated, too irrelevant to early humans whose story is said to unfold elsewhere. But distance is a relative concept, dependent on maps that already presume a centre. When continents occupied different positions, when sea levels were lower, when migration followed coastlines rather than borders, the idea of remoteness dissolves. Human movement, especially in deep prehistory, was not guided by political logic. It followed water, food, stars, seasonal rhythms, and Antarctica, in its warmer intervals, would not have been a void at the edge of the world. It would have been land among other lands. What unsettles this picture is not the possibility of life, but the absence of narrative space for it. There is a peculiar selectivity in how deep time is discussed. Millions of years are allowed for tectonic drift, hundreds of thousands for evolution. But when it comes to organised human presence, the window narrows sharply, as if complexity itself must obey a schedule. Anything that falls outside is gently pushed back into impossibility. And yet, the Earth does not appear to respect this timetable. Satellite imaging has revealed subglacial features beneath Antarctica that resemble river systems, valleys and basins, shaped by flowing water rather than ice. Some of these formations suggest prolonged erosion, not the sudden scouring of glaciers alone. Beneath kilometres of ice there is topography that belongs to a different climate. Water, after all, is patient. It does not carve landscapes in haste. The question that follows is not whether Antarctica was once warmer. That is already accepted. The question is whether something meaningful could have unfolded there during those windows, something later erased not by conquest, but by temperature. Ice is a peculiar eraser. Unlike fire or flood, it preserves even as it hides. It seals rather than destroys. And because of this, it tempts a dangerous comfort, the belief that whatever lies beneath can be recovered intact whenever we choose to look. But ice also delays. It postpones reckoning. Civilizations, if they existed, do not need to have been monumental to matter. They only need to have been central to trade routes, to cosmology, to navigation, to early frameworks of meaning. If such a centre was lost not gradually, but rapidly, through a climatic shift that outpaced adaptation, the resulting fragmentation would look exactly like what the archaeological record shows: sudden dispersal, cultural echoes without clear origin, myths without geography, stories of a world that changed too quickly. In this light, the ice becomes more than a barrier. It becomes a temporal boundary, a line beyond which continuity breaks. There is another discomforting detail. The timing of Antarctica's final deep freeze overlaps with broader global disruptions, periods of rapid climate instability, sea level rise, megafaunal extinctions. These are usually treated as separate chapters, environmental on one side, human on the other. Rarely are they allowed to speak to each other, but separation is a convenience. If a major climatic transition displaced populations on a global scale, then the idea of a single birthplace for civilization becomes less stable. What we call origins may actually be survivors, remnants of something larger, reorganizing themselves in unfamiliar conditions. From this perspective, the ice does not mark the beginning of nothingness. It marks the moment of forgetting. What lies beneath Antarctica does not need to be extraordinary to be unsettling. It only needs to be ordinary enough to challenge the story we tell ourselves about how beginnings are supposed to look. No golden age, no advanced technology, just continuity, broken. The resistance to this idea is quiet but firm. Research proposals remain cautious. Language remains restrained. Possibility is acknowledged then quickly bracketed. Not denied but delayed. Always later. Always when methods improve, always when funding allows. And so Antarctica remains in a state of suspended curiosity. Not forbidden, not embraced, simply postponed. If ice is memory, then Antarctica is a memory we are not ready to access. Not because it threatens certainty, but because it dissolves it. It replaces clean lines with overlapping timelines. It asks whether history is something that happened once, or something that keeps being rearranged by forces indifferent to narrative. The deeper the ice is drilled, the more the question sharpens. At what point does climate become history? And at what point does history become climate? There is no answer here. Only the awareness that beneath the quiet surface, time is stacked rather than passed. And somewhere between those layers, something once stood in the open air, under a sky that did not yet know how to freeze it. The maps arrive quietly, as if uncertain they should exist at all. They are not dramatic objects, No glowing revelations, no declarations carved into stone, just ink, parchment, lines drawn with steady hands long before satellites learned how to see. And yet these lines drift where certainty dissolves, toward a southern landmass shaped in ways that feel uncomfortably precise. What unsettles is not that ancient maps were imperfect. It is that some of them appear too accurate in places where accuracy should have been impossible. Coastlines curve beneath decorative margins. Mountain chains are sketched inland, not guessed, but positioned with a confidence that suggests familiarity. Rivers appear where modern instruments centuries later would confirm buried valleys beneath ice. These features are not labelled as imaginary, they are drawn as known. The usual explanation is inheritance, copying, transmission, a chain of sources stretching backward into obscurity. Mapmakers themselves often insisted they were not inventors, only compilers, translators of something older, something already fading. This is where the discomfort deepens. If these coastlines were drawn without ice, then someone, at some point, had access to a view of Antarctica that no longer exists, either through direct observation or through records produced during a time when such observation was possible. Both options complicate the established sequence of discovery. Critics respond with caution, as they should. They speak of distortion, coincidence, misinterpretation, of southern continents imagined to balance the north, of symbolic geographies rather than physical ones, all reasonable positions. And yet, when radar mapping beneath Antarctic ice reveals shapes that echo these old drawings, coincidence begins to strain. The problem is not that one map aligns, it is that several, produced independently, gesture toward the same contours. This is not proof, it is pattern. Patterns are uncomfortable because they ask for explanation without offering one. To accept that ancient knowledge could include a clear understanding of Antarctica's geography requires a recalibration of assumptions, not necessarily about advanced technology, but about continuity, about what was preserved, what was lost, and what was quietly carried forward under different names. Knowledge does not always survive in its original form. Sometimes it compresses into fragments, myths, diagrams, proportions. Sometimes it becomes ritual. Sometimes it becomes taboo. And sometimes it is reduced to lines on a map copied by hands that no longer remember what they're tracing. If Antarctica once occupied a more central position, geographically or symbolically, it would not have needed to be named as exceptional. It would simply have been land. Known land, and when it disappeared beneath ice, its memory would not vanish instantly. It would linger, distorted, yes, incomplete, certainly, but not erased. What we call imagination may, in such cases, be memory without context. There is a temptation to frame these maps as anomalies, to isolate them so they cannot infect the broader narrative. But isolation itself is a strategy. When a detail does not fit, it is safer to treat it as decorative rather than structural. Yet structure is exactly what these maps imply. They suggest orientation, a world understood in relation to a southern anchor, a reference point that no longer exists above the surface. When that anchor vanished, navigation systems recalibrated, centres shifted. North became dominant not because it always was, but because it remained visible. This raises a quiet question. How much of what we consider central is simply what survived environmental change? Maps do not only record space, they encode worldview. What is placed at the centre, what is pushed to the margins, what is enlarged, what is left blank. In some older cartographies, the southern regions are not marginal. They are proportioned, detailed, deliberate. It is not necessary to claim that Antarctica was once a global capital to feel the disturbance here. It only needs to have mattered more than we allow, enough to be mapped, enough to be remembered indirectly. The resistance to this idea is not aggressive. It is procedural. Peer review, funding constraints, methodological caution, all essential. And yet these systems also carry inertia. They favour explanations that require the fewest revisions to existing frameworks. Antarctica challenges frameworks by existing where frameworks end. There is also the matter of silence. Many early maps that include southern land masses do so without commentary. No legends explaining their origin, no dramatic footnotes, just quiet inclusion. As if the information was unremarkable to those who received it. Silence in historical materials often signals familiarity rather than ignorance. If knowledge of a southern land was once common enough to be unremarkable, then its disappearance would have been gradual, not sudden. Passed down in fragments until it no longer made sense, until it became curiosity instead of orientation. What remains today are not instructions, but shadows, lines that no longer connect to lived geography. The ice, again, plays its role. By covering, it transforms presence into speculation. It creates the illusion that absence was always the rule. And maps, fragile and dismissible, become the only witnesses left to contradict that illusion. To look at these maps is not to find answers. It is to encounter a question that refuses to settle. Who was looking south, and why? Not explorers chasing unknown horizons, but recorders documenting what was already known enough to be drawn, known enough to be kept. If Antarctica was once visible, climatically, culturally, or symbolically, then its disappearance would not mark the end of a place. It would mark the beginning of a long forgetting, one traced quietly in ink, waiting for a future that might notice the lines were never meant to be imaginary. Time, when observed from a distance, does not behave like a straight line. It bends, stretches, overlaps itself. What appears fixed from within a single lifetime becomes unstable when viewed across thousands of years. Antarctica exists inside this instability, not as a place frozen in time, but as a place repeatedly repositioned by it. The Earth does not sit still beneath civilization. It turns, it tilts, it wobbles. Slowly, almost politely, it changes the angle at which sunlight arrives. These movements are subtle enough to escape notice within a generation, yet powerful enough to reshape continents over long durations. Ice advances, ice retreats. What was once temperate becomes hostile. What was once central slips toward the margins. This is not metaphor, it is mechanics. The planet's axial tilt shifts over tens of thousands of years. Its orbit stretches and contracts. These cycles alter climate not locally but globally. Regions drift into and out of habitability without warning or intention. No centre remains permanent. No latitude holds a guarantee. And yet, human history is often written as if geography was stable. Civilizations are described as rising where conditions were favourable, as though those conditions had always been there. Rivers are treated as eternal guides, seasons as predictable partners, but favourable conditions are temporary agreements between Earth and life, subject to renegotiation without notice. If Antarctica once lay within a climatic zone capable of sustaining human presence, even intermittently, then its later descent into ice would not represent an anomaly. It would represent a continuation of planetary behaviour. What would be anomalous is expecting memory to survive such shifts intact. Consider how civilizations respond to environmental stress. They migrate, they fragment, they adapt symbols before they adapt tools. Sacred directions change, stories rearrange their centres. What was once here becomes there, then becomes once. Time does not erase evenly. It preserves some things precisely because others are lost. This complicates the idea of an original centre. A centre implies permanence, stability, gravity. But perhaps the earliest frameworks of human organisation were not built around fixed locations, but around recurring patterns, sun paths, star cycles, seasonal returns. In such a worldview, a centre could move without disappearing. It could shift while remaining conceptually intact. Antarctica, in this sense, does not need to have been a capital of stone. It could have been a reference, a baseline, a point from which movement was understood. When its climate shifted, the reference would remain in memory long after the land itself became inaccessible. There is a quiet arrogance in assuming that what is central now must always have been central. It is the arrogance of survival speaking backward. The places that remained habitable inherited the narrative, not because they were original, but because they endured. When viewed through this lens, the archaeological record begins to feel less like a clean timeline and more like a palimpsest. Layers overwritten by necessity, beginnings rewritten by endings. The absence of evidence becomes less suspicious, not because nothing happened, but because the conditions required to preserve evidence were withdrawn. Antarctica challenges chronology by existing outside of it. Its transformation was not gradual enough to allow smooth cultural adaptation. A warming trend invites adjustment. A rapid freeze forces abandonment. Knowledge carried away under such conditions does not remain whole. It compresses, simplifies, loses precision. This may explain why so many ancient traditions speak of sudden change. Not slow decay, but abrupt loss. A world that tilted, a sky that shifted, a land that vanished. These stories are rarely dated. They resist placement because they describe transition, not location. Modern science acknowledges that abrupt climate events have occurred, periods where temperatures shifted dramatically within a few generations. Sea levels rose quickly, ice sheets advanced rapidly. These events are discussed in isolation as natural phenomena. Rarely are they allowed to intersect fully with human narrative. But intersection is inevitable. If a human population existed in a region rendered uninhabitable within a short span, the cultural shock would echo far beyond the physical displacement. Orientation would be lost, calendars disrupted, ancestral places transformed into myths. From that moment onward, memory would be directional rather than geographic. South would no longer mean a place you could reach. It would mean a place you came from. The modern insistence on fixed origins may itself be a response to this instability, a way of anchoring identity to something that does not move, rivers, valleys, stone. But this anchoring risks mistaking the end point for the beginning. Antarctica, when considered across deep time, behaves less like an exception and more like a reminder that habitability migrates, that centres drift, that what is marginal today may once have been foundational. The difficulty is not in accepting this possibility. The difficulty lies in its implications. If the centre moved once, it can move again. If history was reset by climate rather than conflict, then progress is less secure than we imagine. This is not a prediction. It is an observation. Time does not ask permission before rearranging the map. It does not preserve meaning. It preserves conditions. Meaning is left to follow, often in fragments. So the question remains suspended. If Antarctica was once aligned differently, with the sun, with the seasons, with human movement, then what we call prehistory may simply be history that lost its coordinates. And if coordinates can be lost once, they can be lost again. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, there is a peculiar recurrence of direction. Not north, where mountains dominate myths of ascent. Not east, where dawn becomes rebirth, but south. A direction spoken of less often, and when it is, spoken of with restraint, as if language itself hesitates there. In many ancient traditions, the south is not merely a compass point. It is a threshold, a place associated with departure, with endings that are not final, with lands that once were and are no longer reachable. These references are rarely detailed. They do not describe architecture or rulers. They describe absence, a land that sank, a land that froze, a land that was removed, that What is striking is not the drama of these stories, but their consistency and tone. They are not heroic, they are elegiac. They do not celebrate conquest, they mourn displacement. The loss is presented as collective, not personal, as if something essential was taken from the structure of the world itself. Modern scholarship tends to interpret such myths symbolically. Floods become metaphors, ice becomes purification, lost lands become moral lessons. This approach is not unreasonable. Symbolism is the language of memory when detail has faded. But symbolism does not arise from nothing. It condenses experience. It abstracts trauma. When stories of a vanished southern land appear in unrelated mythological systems, the question is not whether they are literally accurate. The question is why they converge. In some traditions, this lost place is described as a former centre of order, not necessarily a paradise but a reference point. Law, time, and balance were said to originate there. When it was lost, the world entered a diminished state. Seasons grew harsher, lifespans shortened, knowledge fragmented. These are not claims of technological superiority. They are claims of coherence. A world before disruption is remembered not as advanced, but as aligned. This distinction matters, because it suggests that what was lost was not invention, but orientation, a shared framework that made the world intelligible. When that framework collapsed, cultures did not fall into chaos. They adapted. But adaptation required forgetting certain things in order to survive. The idea of a southern origin also appears indirectly, encoded in symbols rather than stories. In cosmological diagrams, sacred geometries, and ritual movements, orientation plays a role that is often dismissed as ceremonial. Yet ceremony preserves structure when explanation is no longer possible. Why turn a certain way? Why align temples along specific axes? Why assign meaning to cardinal directions at all? These practices persist long after their original rationale has vanished. If a foundational reference point was lost, rendered inaccessible by climate rather than conflict, its memory would not disappear entirely. It would be transformed, reduced to gesture, preserved in rhythm, embedded in habit. Myth, in this sense, is not fiction. It is compression. There is a pattern here that resists coincidence. The farther back one looks, the less precise geography becomes, but the more insistent the sense of loss grows. The land is always gone, always unreachable, always described as once known. This is not how imaginary places behave. Imaginary places tend to be embellished. They accumulate detail, lost places shed it. Antarctica, today, fits the description of these mythic absences too well to be ignored. Remote, inhospitable, protected by forces larger than human will, known to exist but forbidden to inhabit. Its inaccessibility is not symbolic. It is enforced by environment. When ancient stories speak of a land removed from human reach, they do not describe exile by decree. They describe exile by nature, ice, water, sky. A shift so complete that return becomes inconceivable. Critics argue that humans project meaning onto extremes, that the poles invite imagination because they resist familiarity. This may be true, but imagination alone does not explain why the same emotional register appears across unrelated cultures. The same sense of something foundational being taken away. There is also the matter of timing. Many myths situate the loss of this southern land at the threshold between ages and before the current order, before the present arrangement of peoples and places. This aligns uncomfortably well with geological evidence of abrupt transitions, periods when climate shifted faster than societies could adjust. Again, this is not confirmation. It is resonance. What makes this resonance unsettling is that it does not demand belief. It only demands tension. The stories do not insist. They linger. They wait. In academic contexts, such material is often quarantined. Myth is separated from geology. Memory is separated from measurement. But the separation itself may be artificial. Human beings do not experience the world in categories. They experience it as continuity until continuity breaks. If Antarctica was once part of that continuity, if it served as a stabilizing reference in a world not yet divided into modern continents, then its loss would echo not just in climate data, but in collective imagination. The silence surrounding this possibility is not hostile, it is careful. Careful not to conflate narrative with evidence, careful not to reopen questions that cannot yet be answered. But care can become avoidance when questions persist too long. What myths offer here is not an alternative history but a pressure point. They push gently against the assumption that civilization has always moved outward from the same few places. They suggest instead a contraction, a retreat from a centre that no longer exists. If that is so, then Antarctica is not absent from human memory. It is present as a shape without coordinates, a direction without a destination. And perhaps that is why it remains so difficult to speak about directly. Because to do so would require admitting that what we call beginnings may actually be after images, reflections cast by a source we no longer know how to face. Material evidence has a peculiar authority. It does not speak, yet it insists. It does not persuade, yet it resists dismissal. Stone tools, worked surfaces, altered landscapes, these things do not argue. They remain, waiting for interpretation that may never fully arrive. When Antarctica enters this discussion, material evidence becomes both the most desired and the most inaccessible form of testimony. Not because nothing could exist there, but because almost everything is sealed beneath ice thick enough to defeat ordinary excavation. Archaeology, in this context, is not limited by imagination, but by physics. And yet, the absence of exposed artifacts has quietly shaped certainty. The prevailing assumption is simple: no ruins visible, therefore no ruins existed, no tools recovered, therefore no hands shaped them. This logic is practical, but it is also incomplete. It presumes that preservation conditions have remained stable, that exposure is a prerequisite for existence. Antarctica challenges this presumption by hiding almost everything equally well, whether it is ancient or recent, human or geological. In other regions of the world, archaeology is biased toward durability. Stone survives, wood rots, ice preserves selectively, often favouring organic material over structure, memory over monument. What might remain beneath Antarctica would not resemble the ruins we expect. It would be quieter, fragmented, out of context. This complicates the question of human capability in deep prehistory, not because it demands advanced technology, but because it disrupts the image of simplicity. Early humans are often imagined as limited by necessity, constrained to small-scale adaptation. But adaptation itself is a form of intelligence, and intelligence does not progress uniformly. Archaeological discoveries elsewhere have already forced revisions, stonework older than expected, precision cuts where only crude tools were assumed, long-distance transport of materials long before agriculture. These findings do not rewrite history entirely, but they stretch it. They suggest that human capacity has always exceeded the stories told about it. If such capacities existed in environments now exposed, there is no principled reason to assume they could not have existed in environments now buried. The difficulty lies in visibility. Antarctica offers almost none. Radar surveys have revealed anomalies beneath the ice, linear features, rectilinear formations, patterns that invite curiosity but resist classification. Most are explained as natural: subglacial ridges, fault lines, ice movement artifacts, and these explanations may be correct. But explanation is not the same as closure. Natural processes can produce order. They can also obscure human-made order until the distinction becomes ambiguous. The question is not whether Antarctica hides sitters. That question is too narrow, too cinematic. The more unsettling question is whether it hides traces of organisation that would no longer be recognisable as such. Camps, pathways, modified terrain, alignments that only made sense within a vanished environmental context. Material culture does not need to be monumental to matter. It only needs to reflect intention. One of the quietest resistances in this field is the idea that human presence must leave unmistakable signatures, that if people lived somewhere, the evidence would announce itself. This belief is shaped by environments where erosion is slow and excavation is easy. Antarctica inverts these conditions. It erases visibility while preserving depth. There is also the matter of scale. Human groups in deep time were smaller, more mobile, more responsive to seasonal change. Their material footprint would have been light, efficient, designed to move rather than endure. In such cases, disappearance does not require catastrophe. It requires relocation. If a climatic shift rendered Antarctica uninhabitable within a few generations, the response would not be resistance. It would be departure, tools carried away, structures abandoned, landscapes left to freeze over. What remained would be minimal by design. This creates a paradox. The more adaptive a culture is, the less evidence it leaves behind. Modern archaeology often privileges sedentism, farming, permanence, walls, but these are late strategies. Earlier forms of organisation may have prioritised flexibility over accumulation, knowledge over architecture, orientation over ownership. Such cultures would be nearly invisible beneath ice. There is also the question of where displaced knowledge goes. When populations migrate, they do not leave empty-handed. They carry practices, stories, techniques. These elements reappear elsewhere, often stripped of origin. The same stoneworking method emerges in multiple regions. The same symbolic motifs recur without clear lineage. This diffusion is usually explained through gradual spread, but diffusion can also be sudden, driven by necessity rather than contact. If Antarctica once hosted human populations, their dispersal would have been directional, northward, towards survivable latitudes. The material evidence of their presence would not remain at the source. It would appear at the destinations. This reverses the usual logic. Instead of looking for beginnings where the evidence accumulates, one must look for accumulation as evidence of loss elsewhere. Antarctica, under this view, is not empty because nothing happened there. It is empty because what happened there could not stay. The resistance to this idea is understandable. It undermines the comfort of fixed origins. It suggests that archaeology may be mapping endpoints rather than sources, that what we call earliest may simply be what survived environmental displacement. There is no need to imagine sophistication beyond necessity. No lost machines, no forgotten sciences, only people responding intelligently to a changing world, building what they could, leaving when they had to. Ice does not discriminate between what it covers. It seals equally the trivial and the transformative, and because of this, Antarctica becomes a blind spot, not because it lacks history, but because it withholds access to it. Material evidence, when denied visibility, forces a different kind of listening, one that attends to patterns rather than objects, to echoes rather than artifacts. The question, then, is not whether archaeology has failed Antarctica. It is whether Antarctica is asking archaeology to reconsider what counts as evidence at all. Life leaves traces even when it does not intend to be remembered. It breathes into the soil, alters the chemistry of air and water, shifts the balance of what can grow and what cannot. Long after bodies vanish, these subtle signatures remain. In Antarctica, such traces exist, quiet, scattered, often overlooked, not as proof of human presence, but as reminders that the continent was once biologically alive in ways that resist its current image. Beneath the ice, beneath the narrative of sterility, there are records of abundance. Ice cores extracted from Antarctica do more than measure temperature. They preserve pollen grains, spores, microbial remnants. These particles do not travel randomly. They settle where ecosystems once functioned. Their presence implies not only warmth, but continuity, seasons stable enough for life cycles to repeat. At various points in the past, Antarctica supported tundra, forests, wetlands. Not briefly, not precariously, but long enough for complex ecological relationships to form. This is not conjecture. Fossilized leaves, ancient root systems, and sediment layers shaped by flowing fresh water all point to sustained habitability. Habitability, however, is a word that invites hesitation. It suggests potential without commitment, a place that could support life, but does not insist that it did. And yet, wherever Earth offers stable conditions, life tends to appear, not as an exception, but as a response. Biology does not wait for permission. It fills available niches with persistence that borders on inevitability. The question that follows is not whether life existed in Antarctica's warmer periods. That's established. The question is whether human life could have intersected with those ecosystems, even briefly, even marginally. Here, resistance returns, not in the form of denial, but in the form of scale. The argument is that human populations were too sparse, too constrained, too localized to reach such southern latitudes. But this argument relies on modern assumptions about movement. It imagines migration as linear, cautious, bounded by fear of the unknown. Yet early humans did not experience the world as a map. They experienced it as a gradient of opportunity. Coastlines were pathways, currents were guides. The absence of borders made distance less meaningful than resource availability. If Antarctica offered food, fresh water, and seasonal stability during certain periods, it would not have been ignored simply because it lay to the south. Direction does not deter movement. Inhospitality does. The biological record suggests that Antarctica was not always inhospitable. There is also the matter of adaptation. Humans are not specialists. They are generalists. Their survival strategy is not optimization for one environment, but flexibility across many. This trait allowed them to expand rapidly into diverse regions, deserts, highlands, forests, coastlines, often faster than ecosystems could stabilize. In such a context, Antarctica's ancient ecosystems would not have presented an insurmountable barrier. They would have been another variation in a long series of adjustments. What complicates this possibility is the speed of change. Paleoclimatic data indicates that some Antarctic transitions were abrupt, temperature shifts occurring over centuries, sometimes less. Ecosystems collapse under such conditions. Species migrate or vanish. Humans, if present, would have been forced to respond quickly. This kind of disruption leaves a different biological signature, not continuity, but interruption, a sudden absence where presence was once possible. An interruption is difficult to interpret. It does not leave neat layers, it leaves gaps. In other parts of the world, similar gaps exist. Regions where human presence appears, then disappears, then reappears much later. These are often explained through local factors: drought, resource depletion, conflict. Rarely are they connected to global climatic events. Antarctica challenges this compartmentalization. If a major climatic shift rendered the continent uninhabitable, it would not have done so in isolation. It would have been part of a planetary reorganization. Ice expansion in the south correlates with changes elsewhere. Sea levels adjust, weather patterns shift, habitable zones migrate. From this perspective, Antarctica's biological history becomes a mirror rather than an anomaly. What lived there, and then could no longer, echoes what happened across the globe. The difference is visibility. Other regions remained accessible. Antarctica did not. Biology also preserves absence in another way: genetic bottlenecks. Sudden reductions in population diversity leave marks in DNA. Some researchers have noted bottlenecks in human genetic history that align with periods of climatic instability. These are not tied to specific locations. They are global signatures of stress. While such data cannot point directly to Antarctica, it does reinforce a broader pattern. The human story includes moments of contraction as well as expansion, loss as well as growth. In this light, the idea of a southern centre becomes less literal and more structural. Antarctica does not need to have hosted large populations. It only needs to have been part of a network of habitability that collapsed unevenly. When that network broke, its southernmost nodes would have vanished first. The biological silence that followed would not erase memory immediately. It would transform it. Stories of abundance would become stories of loss. Directions would become symbols. A place once known through living contact would survive only through absence. Today, Antarctica is often described as pristine, untouched. But this purity is a result of erasure, not origin. It is what remains when life withdraws and time seals the withdrawal beneath ice. The biological record does not tell us who lived there. It does not tell us how. It only tells us that life was once possible and that possibility ended. The deeper question is what happens to meaning when a place capable of sustaining life becomes incapable of sustaining memory. If Antarctica once participated in the web of living systems that shaped early human movement, then its freezing was not just an environmental event. It was a rupture in continuity, one that forced the world to reorganize without it. And perhaps that is why Antarctica feels less like an edge of the map and more like a missing piece. Not because it holds answers, but because its silence aligns too closely with moments when life elsewhere began to tell a story of recovery rather than origin. Breaks in history rarely announce themselves. They arrive without ceremony, without titles, without witnesses capable of recording what is happening while it happens. From the inside, a rupture feels like confusion. From the outside, centuries later, it looks like a gap. Antarctica sits adjacent to one of these gaps, not as the cause, but as a measure of scale. There are moments in Earth's past when change accelerates beyond the pace of culture. Temperatures shift faster than traditions can adapt. Coastlines redraw themselves within lifetimes. Ecosystems collapse before stories can stabilize around them. These moments are not gradual declines. They are thresholds crossed too quickly to be understood in real time. Geological records confirm that such thresholds exist. Ice cores, sediment layers, and oceanic data all point to episodes of abrupt climatic change. Events compressed into spans short enough to disrupt entire ways of life. These are not the slow arcs of evolution. They are interruptions. An interruption leaves a distinctive imprint. Not ruins, but discontinuity. What follows such events is not immediate recovery. It is reorientation. If Antarctica transitioned rapidly from a marginally habitable region into a frozen one, the consequences would not have remained local. The expansion of ice alters global circulation. Winds shift. Rain belts move. Sea levels respond. Habitable zones contract and migrate. In such a scenario, human societies would not simply relocate geographically. They would reorganize cognitively. What mattered before might no longer matter. What could be relied upon would change. This is where the idea of a reset begins to surface, not as a dramatic ending, but as a quiet realignment. A reset does not erase humanity. It erases continuity. After major disruptions, cultures tend to simplify. Complex systems give way to resilient ones. Knowledge that requires infrastructure fades faster than knowledge embedded in story, ritual, or bodily practice. What survives is what can travel. From this perspective, the earliest civilizations we recognize may not represent the dawn of complexity, but its return. This possibility is unsettling because it reframes progress. It suggests that what we call beginnings may actually be recoveries, partial reconstructions built atop fragments that survive displacement. Antarctica, in this framing, becomes a marker of scale. Its freezing would not have been an isolated loss. It would have coincided with other losses, some visible, some not. Coastal inundation, habitat collapse, resource redistribution. These pressures would have forced populations into motion simultaneously. Mass movement does not preserve hierarchy, it dissolves it. In the aftermath, social memory compresses, long timelines shorten, ancestral places blur. What was once known directly becomes mythic. What was once central becomes unreachable. This process does not require an external force to guide it. It requires only speed. When change occurs faster than explanation, meaning lags behind reality. People adapt first. Understanding comes later, often in distorted form. Stories attempt to stabilize what can no longer be revisited. This is why so many ancient narratives describe a before that feels qualitatively different rather than technologically superior. The difference is not one of invention, but of coherence, a world that made sense because its conditions were stable. After disruption, stability must be rebuilt from what remains. The archaeological record reflects this unevenness. Certain skills appear suddenly refined, others vanish without clear lineage, settlement patterns reset, population densities fluctuate. These features are often interpreted as local developments, but taken together they suggest a broader systemic shock. Antarctica's role in this shock is indirect but instructive. Its transformation represents one of the most extreme environmental shifts available for study. A continent-scale loss of habitability. If such a loss occurred rapidly, it would have acted as a forcing function on global systems. And yet, in historical narratives, Antarctica remains curiously absent. Its story is treated as environmental, not cultural, as if ice could not intersect with memory. But memory does not require monuments, it requires disruption. When a reference point disappears, whether geographic, climatic, or symbolic, the systems built around it destabilize. Orientation must be re-established elsewhere. New centers emerge not because they are original, but because they are available. This is how resets operate. They are not clean slates, they are rearrangements. The danger of the word reset lies in its finality. It implies a button pressed, a complete wipe. But what the evidence suggests is something softer and more insidious. Erosion of context. Survival without continuity. Growth without origin. In such conditions, history becomes a series of approximations. Each generation inherits less clarity about what came before, even as it builds more confidently on what it can see. Antarctica, locked beneath ice, would have exited the human world entirely. Not conquered, not destroyed, simply removed from participation. Its absence would have been total enough to reshape assumptions about where civilization could begin. Over time, this absence would harden into certainty. If no one could return, then no one had ever been there. If nothing could be found, then nothing had been lost. This is not deception, it is adaptation. The human mind prefers stable narratives, especially after instability. It prefers to locate beginnings in places that still exist. It prefers rivers over glaciers, valley over voids. And so the story reorganizes itself. What remains, scattered across myth, climate data, and material gaps, is not a hidden history but a distorted one. A record shaped by what survived the last major disruption. If Antarctica was once part of the human world, then its removal would mark not the end of that world, but the boundary beyond which continuity could not follow. Everything after would feel like a beginning, even if it was not. The unsettling question is not whether such a reset occurred. It is whether we are still living inside the assumptions it produced, mistaking recovery for origin and survival for firstness. And if that is so, then Antarctica is not merely frozen. It is holding the edge of a memory that humanity learned to live without. When continuity breaks, memory does not disappear. It changes its shape. What cannot be preserved as record survives as pattern. What cannot be named survives as symbol. After a rupture large enough to scatter people and reorder landscapes, Knowledge no longer travels as explanation, it travels as resonance. This is where collective memory begins to behave strangely. Across early cultures, there are ideas that appear without clear ancestry, symbols that repeat without agreement, structures of thought that emerge fully formed, as if inherited rather than invented. They do not announce themselves as remnants. They arrive already embedded, treated as self-evident. Modern interpretation often explains this through parallel development, similar minds reaching similar conclusions under similar pressures. Sometimes this is sufficient, but sometimes the similarities go deeper than necessity requires. They suggest not convergence, but inheritance. After a large-scale disruption, people do not carry libraries. They carry fragments, rhythms, directions, taboos, stories whose meanings have thinned but whose emotional weight remains intact. These fragments recombine in new places, forming cultures that feel original, while quietly echoing something older. This process produces a distinctive pattern: widespread agreement about structure, paired with disagreement about origin. Time is divided into ages. History is framed as decline from an earlier state of balance. Knowledge is remembered as having been given, not discovered. Sacred order is said to precede human institutions. These ideas appear across civilizations that never met. They are rarely interrogated because they feel foundational. In such frameworks, the past is not primitive. It is aligned. The present is not advanced. It is unstable. Progress is not upward. It is compensatory. These are not the assumptions of a culture inventing itself for the first time. They are the assumptions of a culture rebuilding after loss. Antarctica enters this discussion not as a named place, but as an absence that helps explain why memory behaves this way. When a reference point is removed entirely, what remains is orientation without coordinates. South becomes symbolic. Not because it was always abstract, but because it ceased to be reachable. In many early systems of thought, directions carry moral or cosmological weight. North and south are not interchangeable. They represent different states of being, different phases of time. These associations persist even when their environmental basis is forgotten. Why does a direction need meaning at all, unless it once mattered materially? Symbols preserve relationships longer than facts. A fact requires context to remain true. A symbol only requires repetition. After disruption, repetition is easier than explanation. This is why so much early knowledge appears encoded rather than stated. Geometry embedded in ritual. Astronomy folded into myth. Environmental awareness disguised as theology. These are not primitive confusions. They are compression strategies. Compression becomes necessary when the systems that supported full understanding no longer exist. In this light, the fragmentation of knowledge following a global disruption would not result in ignorance. It would result in selective clarity. Certain truths would survive because they were useful everywhere. Others would vanish because they depended on specific places that no longer mattered. If Antarctica was one such place, once central then removed, its memory would not survive as geography. It would survive as orientation, as a sense that something important lay beyond reach, as a feeling that the world used to make more sense. This feeling is difficult to measure, but it is remarkably persistent. It appears in the way ancient cultures describe time as cyclical rather than linear. In the assumption that civilizations rise and fall according to forces larger than human intention. In the belief that knowledge can be lost not through error, but through catastrophe. These beliefs are not irrational, they are experiential. When knowledge fragments, authority shifts. Those who remain become custodians of partial truths. Over time, these truths solidify into institutions. The fragments are treated as complete, because nothing else is available. What was once provisional becomes permanent. This is how systems of belief form without deception. No one needs to hide the past if the past is already inaccessible. No one needs to suppress knowledge if the conditions required to understand it no longer exist. Antarctica, sealed beneath the ice, would represent the most extreme version of this inaccessibility. Its removal would not simply erase a location. It would remove an anchor that helped organize early human understanding of the world. Without that anchor, coherence would have to be rebuilt elsewhere. The result would be cultures that share deep structural similarities while disagreeing on surface narratives, myths that feel incomplete, rituals whose purpose is remembered but whose origin is not, knowledge systems that insist something was lost but cannot say what. From the outside, this looks like imagination. From the inside, it feels like inheritance. The danger of dismissing this as coincidence is not that we lose accuracy, it is that we lose sensitivity. We stop listening to the ways in which memory adapts under pressure. History, written only from what survived physically, risks misunderstanding what survived psychologically. If Antarctica once contributed to the human sense of order, through climate orientation or symbolic centrality, its disappearance would have left a mark not in ruins, but in thought. That mark would be subtle, distributed, difficult to isolate. But subtlety does not mean insignificance. It means persistence. What remains today is a world confident in its origins, yet haunted by recurring stories of a loss. A civilization that speaks of progress, yet measures itself against imagined golden ages. A global culture that builds forward while continually looking backward, unsure of what it is trying to recover. Perhaps this is not contradiction. Perhaps it is residue. If a central reference was removed long ago, then humanity has been navigating without a full map ever since, using fragments, symbols, inherited structures whose original purpose dissolved, along with the place that gave them meaning. Antarctica, silent and inaccessible, does not need to confirm this. Its role is already fulfilled by its absence. The question that lingers is whether what we call collective memory is not memory of events at all, but memory of orientation, a sense of where the world once aligned before it was forced to reorganize itself around what remained. And if that orientation was lost once, it may still be shaping how we understand beginnings, endings, and the fragile space in between. Every history rests on a decision long forgotten. Not a conspiracy, not a decree, just a preference that hardened into method. At some point, someone chose where to begin the story. That choice shaped everything that followed, not by malice, but by convenience. Origins are easier to tell when they are visible, reachable, excavatable. They are easier still when they align with the institutions that inherit the telling. Knowledge does not float freely. It settles where it can be supported. When modern history defines the beginning of civilization, it does so through criteria that feel neutral. Writing, agriculture, permanent settlement, architecture. These are measurable. They leave traces. They fit comfortably into museums and timelines. They also favour places that remained exposed after the last major disruptions, valleys rather than voids, rivers rather than ice. This is not bias in the moral sense, it is bias in the structural sense. Antarctica does not meet these criteria, not because it could not have, but because it cannot now. Its inaccessibility disqualifies it before questions are even formed. What cannot be excavated cannot be dated. What cannot be dated cannot be placed. What cannot be placed is quietly excluded. Over time, exclusion begins to feel like certainty. Institutions of knowledge are not static. They evolve in response to funding, politics, pedagogy, and public expectation. Certain questions are encouraged because they promise clarity. Others are discouraged because they complicate existing frameworks without offering resolution. Antarctica, as a potential locus of early human significance, belongs to the latter category. It demands interdisciplinary thinking. It resists definitive answers. It threatens to expand timelines rather than refine them. These qualities do not make it wrong, they make it inconvenient. In academic practice, inconvenience is often reframed as improbability. This is not unique to Antarctica. Throughout history, ideas that challenge foundational assumptions tend to be sidelined until the evidence becomes overwhelming, or until the assumptions themselves lose relevance. The process is slow, procedural, almost invisible. What emerges instead is a canon, a set of accepted starting points that function less as hypotheses and more as anchors. Once anchored, narratives grow around them. Educational systems adapt. Public understanding solidifies. The anchor becomes difficult to move without disturbing everything attached to it. Civilization, in this sense, has been anchored to places that survived. The question, where did it begin, is often treated as descriptive, but it is also prescriptive. It determines which regions are seen as formative and which are seen as peripheral, which peoples are framed as inheritors and which as latecomers, which stories are foundational and which are supplemental. Antarctica, by virtue of being uninhabited today, cannot easily claim inheritance. It has no descendants to advocate for its memory, no continuous culture to insist on its relevance. Silence becomes mistaken for absence. There is also the matter of authority. Knowledge systems rely on consensus, but consensus forms within boundaries. What is taught repeatedly gains legitimacy. What is not taught becomes invisible. Over generations, invisibility turns into disbelief. This process does not require suppression. It requires repetition. Once a narrative of origins is established, alternative possibilities must clear a higher bar. They must not only present evidence, but justify why that evidence was overlooked. The burden shifts from explanation to defense. Most ideas do not survive this shift. Antarctica has never been given the opportunity to clear such a bar, because it has never been fully permitted into the conversation. Its role has been defined in advance as environmental rather than cultural. Ice, not memory. Science, not story. Yet this division is artificial. Climate shapes culture. Geography shapes myth. Absence shapes belief. To treat Antarctica as outside human history is to assume that human history can be cleanly separated from planetary history. This assumption simplifies analysis, but it distorts scale. There is an unease beneath this simplification, a recognition, rarely voiced, that our criteria for beginnings may be circular. We look for civilization where civilization survived. We define survival as proof of origin. We then reinforce the definition through education. What falls outside this loop becomes unimaginable. Antarctica threatens the loop because it suggests that origins may not be located where survival was easiest, that the earliest centres may have been the most vulnerable to environmental change, that disappearance, rather than endurance, may be the defining feature of the first chapter. Such a possibility does not negate established histories, it reframes them. It turns them from beginnings into continuations, from births into recoveries. This reframing is not neutral. It redistributes significance. It questions why certain regions are granted the status of cradle, while others are denied even the status of question. Knowledge systems tend to protect their cradles. There is also the practical concern of uncertainty. Institutions prefer questions that can be answered within reasonable bounds. Antarctica offers no such promise. Even with advanced technology, access is limited. Excavation is costly. Interpretation would remain speculative for decades. Speculation, in academic contexts, is treated cautiously, not because it is always wrong, but because it resists closure. Antarctica would introduce a permanent open end into the story of human origins. Open ends are uncomfortable, and yet history is already full of them. They are simply hidden behind conventions, accepted gaps, assumed absences, unasked questions. The authority to define origins, then, is not a matter of truth versus falsehood. It is a matter of narrative stability. What allows a story to be told repeatedly without breaking? Antarctica does not allow this. Its very nature destabilizes. It asks whether our definitions are shaped by what we can reach rather than what once mattered. This does not imply deception. It implies limitation. Every era tells the story of the past with the tools it has. Our tools favour exposure, excavation, and continuity. They do not favour concealment, compression, or sudden loss. Antarctica embodies all three. If it once played a role in the human story, that role would not fit neatly into current frameworks. It would demand new categories, new methods, new patience. Until such patience is cultivated, Antarctica will remain classified as irrelevant. Not because it is, but because relevance has been defined elsewhere. The question, then, is not whether Antarctica was the original centre of human civilization. The deeper question is whether our systems of knowledge are capable of recognising a centre that no longer exists in any accessible form. And if they are not, how many other beginnings have already been excluded, not by intent, but by design? Exploration is often remembered for what it reveals, but its quieter legacy lies in what it leaves unresolved. In the history of Antarctica, this quietness is striking. There are expeditions well documented, celebrated, repeated in textbooks, and then there are others, mentioned briefly, summarised incompletely, or preserved only through fragments of correspondence and second-hand references. The difference is not always significance. Sometimes it is alignment. Early encounters with Antarctica were framed as endurance narratives. Ice, wind, isolation. Human presence defined by struggle rather than curiosity. These stories were compelling, and they shaped expectations. Antarctica became a place where survival itself was the achievement, leaving little conceptual space for deeper inquiry into what might lie beneath the surface. Yet within the records of exploration, there are pauses that feel disproportionate to their circumstances, logs that skip days, reports that generalize where specificity would be expected, geological observations noted then not pursued, anomalies mentioned once and never again. These are not proofs of concealment, they are signs of discontinuity, moments where observation exceeded interpretation. Explorers were not archaeologists. They were not equipped, financially or conceptually, to pursue questions beyond immediate objectives. When unexpected features appeared, strange rock formations, unusual sediment layers, topographies inconsistent with prevailing models, they were often recorded neutrally and left there. Not because they were unimportant, but because they did not fit the mission. Institutional attention follows intention. Much of Antarctica's exploration history unfolded under geopolitical pressure. Claims, treaties, boundaries. Scientific presence was allowed precisely because it could be regulated. Research agendas were shaped accordingly. Glaciology, meteorology, climate systems. Questions about deep human history did not belong to this framework. They required assumptions no one was prepared to make, and so they remained peripheral. Archives reflect this selectivity. What is preserved in full tends to be what was anticipated. What was unexpected often appears only as marginal notes. Over time, margins fade. This is not censorship, it is triage. In the processing of vast quantities of data, decisions must be made about relevance. Data that cannot be contextualized is difficult to integrate. It waits, sometimes indefinitely. Antarctica's archives contain much that is waiting. There is also the matter of interpretation. Early geological surveys sometimes proposed hypotheses that were later revised or abandoned as models improved. This is normal scientific progression. But in the process, certain observations were quietly reclassified as errors rather than anomalies. An anomaly that resists explanation for too long risks being dismissed as noise. What is rarely acknowledged is that noise can be contextual. It can be a signal that lacks a framework rather than validity. Antarctica, because it exists at the edge of habitability, generates many such signals. The continent's isolation compounds this effect. Findings cannot be easily cross-checked with local cultural records. There are no oral histories anchored to the land, no continuity of occupation to provide interpretive scaffolding. Everything must be inferred indirectly. This creates a tendency toward conservatism. When in doubt, default to the simplest explanation. Geological over cultural, environmental over historical, ice over memory. The Antarctic Treaty System reinforces this indirectly. By framing the continent as a place for peaceful scientific study, it also frames the scope of acceptable inquiry. Research that aligns with climate science flourishes. Research that ventures into speculative intersections between geology and human history struggles to find footing. Speculation, even careful, sourced speculation, is treated as distraction. Yet history is full of moments when distraction became discovery. There are also gaps created by practical limitations. Excavation beneath ice requires resources beyond most archaeological projects. Even when technology allows imaging, interpretation remains ambiguous. Rectilinear forms may be natural. Anomalous readings may be artifacts of equipment. Each uncertainty compounds caution. Caution, over time, hardens into silence. The result is a body of records that feels oddly incomplete, not because information is missing, but because certain questions were never asked long enough to accumulate answers. Antarctica's story becomes one of environment alone, stripped of potential human relevance by default. This default shapes expectation. New researchers enter the field already knowing what Antarctica is for. They do not look for what it has been defined not to contain. In this way, absence becomes self-reinforcing. It is worth noting that some of the most significant historical revisions began as peripheral curiosities, anomalies that did not fit prevailing models, data points that refused to resolve. Antarctica may represent not a hidden archive, but a postponed one. The difference matters. A hidden archive implies intent. A postponed archive implies unreadiness. The tools, concepts, or patience required to engage it fully have not yet aligned. What remains today is a continent whose official record feels smooth, where one might expect friction. Clean narratives where complexity should intrude. An absence of controversy, not because controversy has been settled, but because it has not been allowed to surface. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about how knowledge moves through institutions. Antarctica does not shout. It does not interrupt. It waits. If there were moments in its exploration history when questions brushed against uncomfortable possibilities about time depth, human adaptability, or forgotten centres, they would not appear as revelations. They would appear as hesitations, as footnotes, as data sets quietly archived and never revisited. History is shaped as much by what was postponed as by what was pursued, and perhaps this is Antarctica's most consistent role. Not as a place of secrets, but as a place of delay, where inquiry moves slowly enough for assumptions to solidify elsewhere. If the original centre of human civilization lay beyond the reach of early archaeology, beyond the patience of institutions, beyond the climate of sustained inquiry, then it would not need to be hidden. It would only need to wait. The question that lingers is whether the waiting has ended, or whether Antarctica is still holding questions that our systems of knowledge have not yet learned how to ask. Ice does not merely conceal, it records. Layer by layer, year by year, it settles without judgment, preserving whatever the world allows to fall into it. Air becomes trapped. Dust becomes dated. Ash remembers eruptions long forgotten. In Antarctica, this accumulation reaches a scale unmatched anywhere else on Earth. Kilometers of compressed time stacked patiently, indifferent to meaning. To approach Antarctica as a temporal archive is to shift the question entirely. It is no longer about what might be found on the surface, but about what has been sealed away with precision that no human hand could achieve. Ice is not selective. It archives everything equally: catastrophe and calm, abundance and collapse. This makes it an uncomfortable witness. Ice cores reveal not just temperature, but rhythm. Pulses of stability interrupted by sharp transitions. Long periods where the planet held its breath, followed by moments where it seemed to exhale too quickly. These transitions do not align neatly with cultural timelines. They precede them, they shape them. When a climatic shift is abrupt enough, it does not negotiate with societies, it displaces them. Antarctica's ice preserves evidence of such abruptness: rapid changes in atmospheric composition, sudden influxes of particulates, chemical signatures that suggest events occurring faster than ecosystems could adjust. These are not gradual stories, they are punctuations. The unsettling possibility is not that these events occurred, but that they occurred while humans were already present elsewhere, and perhaps here. If ice is memory, then Antarctica is not empty. It is full of moments that the rest of the world forgot because it could not afford to remember them. Catastrophe is rarely preserved in narrative. It is too disruptive. Survival demands simplification. Ice, however, does not simplify. Within its layers are records of storms that reshaped coastlines, volcanic winters that darkened skies, shifts in ocean circulation that altered rainfall patterns across continents. These events do not stay local. They ripple outward, forcing adaptation far from their origin. Antarctica, through its ice, becomes a silent chronicle of planetary stress. What is missing from this chronicle is human interpretation, not because it cannot exist, but because it has not been attempted at the necessary scale. Ice cores are read primarily for climate, not culture. Their timelines are aligned with glacial cycles, not migration patterns. The data exists, but its narrative context remains narrow. This narrowing is understandable. Climate science alone is vast. Adding human history complicates it exponentially. But complexity does not negate relevance. If human societies were present during periods of rapid climatic transition, their responses would be encoded indirectly in the ice, not as artifacts but as consequences. Increased burning, altered land use, shifts in atmospheric composition driven by survival strategies. These signals would be subtle, easily dismissed as natural variability. Especially if no framework exists to interpret them as cultural. Antarctica resists such frameworks because it has been defined as pre-cultural, a place where human influence is assumed absent by default. This assumption simplifies analysis, but it also blinds it. Ice does not distinguish between natural and human-caused particulates. It records both. The deeper one looks into Antarctic ice, the more one encounters time behaving differently. Events that appear distant in human history sit adjacent in compressed layers. Thousands of years reduced to meters. Centuries pressed into centimeters. The illusion of separation dissolves. This compression mirrors what may have happened to memory itself after disruption. Long sequences collapsed into symbols. Detailed histories flattened into archetypes. What survived did so not in order but in fragments. Antarctica's ice thus becomes a metaphor and a mechanism. It shows how time can be preserved while meaning is lost. If a human presence existed there before the deep freeze, it would not announce itself through grand markers. It would be encoded in transitions, in the sudden absence of certain biological indicators, in the appearance of others elsewhere. Displacement leaves fingerprints even when departure is orderly. The difficulty lies in interpretation. Climate scientists are cautious for good reason. They avoid anthropocentric readings of data. They resist narratives that cannot be conclusively tested. Antarctica's ice demands patience that extends beyond disciplinary boundaries. What it offers is not evidence of civilization, but evidence of interruption. An interruption is the shadow of presence. The idea that Antarctica might function as a time capsule unsettles, because it reverses expectation. Time capsules are meant to be opened. Antarctica's remains closed by necessity. Its contents are accessible only through proxies, cores, scans, models. Each step away from direct observation adds uncertainty. Yet uncertainty does not equal insignificance. In fact, the most consequential moments in human history are often those we understand least clearly. Periods of transition, collapse, reorganization. Antarctica's ice is thickest precisely where clarity is thinnest. If the original center of human civilization was not a city, but a climatic balance, one that allowed coherence to emerge, then Antarctica's freezing would mark not the loss of a place but the loss of equilibrium. Equilibrium leaves no monuments. It leaves only absence where presence once felt natural. Ice preserves this absence with fidelity. It holds the record of when balance tipped, when systems shifted too fast to follow. It does not explain why. It does not assign blame. It simply keeps time. Perhaps this is why Antarctica feels less like a mystery to be solved, and more like a silence to be interpreted. Its archive is intact, but unread in the language of human continuity. If we listen only for what we expect to hear, we will find nothing. If we learn to listen for interruption, for compression, for traces that do not announce themselves as human, the archive may begin to speak differently. Not in names, not in dates, but in the rhythm of loss. And if Antarctica is holding such a rhythm, stacked beneath ice beyond ordinary reach, then it is not waiting to reveal a forgotten civilization. It is waiting for us to recognize that civilization itself may have been shaped by what the ice remembers and what the world outside it was forced to forget. When the familiar centers of civilization are placed side by side, a pattern begins to emerge, not one of connection, but of timing. River valleys awaken within a narrow window. Cities rise along distant waters almost simultaneously, separated by geography but aligned in chronology. Agriculture stabilizes, writing appears. Writing, monumental architecture follows. The story is often told as parallel invention, as though human ingenuity reached a threshold and expressed itself everywhere at once. What is less often asked is why this threshold appears when it does. If these centers were truly independent beginnings, their timing would not need to align so closely. Variation would be expected, delay, asymmetry. Instead, what we see is clustering. Civilization not as a slow ignition spreading outward, but as a response triggered across regions already under pressure. This clustering becomes more curious when placed against what came before. There is a silence preceding the rise of these centers, a long stretch of human presence without large-scale settlement, without writing, without monumental permanence, then suddenly density, structure, acceleration. This silence is usually described as prehistory, a necessary prelude, a long apprenticeship before mastery. But the duration of this prelude is striking. Tens of thousands of years of behavioral consistency, followed by a rapid shift in complexity. Transitions of this scale rarely occur without cause. If Antarctica is introduced into this temporal alignment, not as a competing center, but as a missing one, the silence begins to feel less like absence and more like aftermath. The rise of known civilizations becomes less mysterious, not because it was inevitable, but because it may have been reactive. A world reorganizing after loss does not rebuild slowly, it rebuilds urgently. The locations of early civilizations share another feature. They are all places of refuge, regions buffered from extreme climate volatility, areas where water remained accessible as sea levels shifted, landscapes capable of supporting displaced populations. These are not places chosen for novelty, they are places chosen for survival. If a global disruption forced movement on a planetary scale, populations would converge on similar environments independently. This convergence would produce the illusion of parallel invention. Similar problems would demand similar solutions. Agriculture, storage, social hierarchy, These are not creative leaps. They are stabilizing responses. Seen this way, the first cities are not origins, they are anchors. Antarctica's absence sharpens this interpretation. Its complete withdrawal from habitability would have removed a stabilizing region from the global system. Its loss would not be localized. It would have altered circulation patterns, resource availability, and migration routes everywhere. The regions that later flourished would be those least affected by cascading instability. Not necessarily the most innovative, but the most resilient. This reframing does not diminish their achievements, it contextualizes them. Civilization, under this view, is not a singular invention, but a repeated attempt to restore coherence after fragmentation. Writing emerges not because humans suddenly desired record-keeping, but because memory became unreliable. Monumental architecture arises not because permanence was newly imagined, but because impermanence had become threatening. The known centres of civilization share this urgency. Their myths speak of beginnings that are already haunted by loss, floods remembered, ages diminished, knowledge received from predecessors rather than discovered anew. These are not the myths of firstness, they are the myths of inheritance. If Antarctica once functioned as part of a broader stabilizing system, climatic, symbolic, or geographic, its disappearance would have created a void that could not be filled immediately. The world would have needed time to recalibrate. That recalibration period may be what we call prehistory. The sudden flowering of civilizations would then mark not the dawn of order, but its return. This possibility challenges a deep assumption, that complexity naturally accumulates, that once discovered, it remains. But history offers little support for this optimism. Complexity requires conditions. When conditions collapse, complexity collapses with them. Antarctica's transformation represents one of the most extreme condition changes imaginable. Its loss would have destabilized patterns that early humans relied upon long before cities existed. The fact that known civilizations arise only after this loss is not proof of causation, but it is a relationship that demands consideration. What is striking is how rarely Antarctica is included in discussions of early civilization timing at all. Its climatic shifts are acknowledged, but compartmentalized, treated as background noise rather than a driving force. This compartmentalization allows the story of civilization to remain clean. Beginnings remain localized. Progress remains linear. But the Earth does not operate in compartments. When ice expands, oceans respond. When oceans respond, coastlines move. When coastlines move, people move. These movements ripple outward, compressing time, forcing convergence. The early centres of civilization may represent the places where this convergence stabilized. If so, then asking whether Antarctica was the original centre is the wrong question. The more precise question is whether the original configuration of the world, before the last major disruption, allowed for multiple centres that no longer exist. Antarctica's role would then be neither central nor peripheral, but structural. Its loss would have altered the entire system, making new centres necessary rather than possible. This interpretation explains both the clustering of civilizations and the shared sense of loss embedded in their foundational narratives. It explains why beginnings are remembered as returns, why the past is described as greater, not simpler. It also explains the unease that accompanies attempts to push origins further back. Each extension threatens to dissolve the idea of a singular beginning altogether. Perhaps civilization does not begin once. Perhaps it resumes. And perhaps Antarctica marks the last time the world was arranged differently enough that such a resumption became necessary. If that is the case, then the familiar centres of civilization are not answers to the question of origin. They are responses to a condition created elsewhere, by forces that removed a part of the world from participation entirely. The silence before them is not empty, it is compressed, waiting. And the question that remains unresolved is whether we are willing to treat that silence not as ignorance, but as the echo of a world reorganizing itself after losing something it could not replace. A reset is rarely experienced as an ending. From within it, a reset feels like survival, like narrowing focus, like letting go of what cannot be carried. Only later, when distance allows reflection, does it appear as rupture, as a line dividing before and after. Human history contains more of these lines than it admits. They do not appear as clean breaks in the record. They appear as compression, as sudden simplification, as cultures that seem to begin with an unusual sense of caution, as though aware, without knowing why, that stability cannot be taken for granted. The idea of a reset is uncomfortable because it challenges inheritance. It suggests that what we know is not what was known, that what we build is not built on foundations, but on remnants. This discomfort is often resolved by framing resets as local. A drought here, a collapse there, manageable, containable events. But some disruptions do not remain local. When climate shifts rapidly, when sea levels rise within generations, when entire regions become uninhabitable, the resulting pressure is global. Not everyone is affected equally, but no one remains untouched. Migration cascades, knowledge fragments, social structures flatten and reform. This kind of reset does not announce itself. It simply leaves the world rearranged. Antarctica's disappearance into ice would have been such a rearrangement. Not a catastrophe in the cinematic sense, but a slow violence completed too quickly for adaptation. A region removed not by fire or flood, but by cold, a condition that does not destroy immediately, but makes return impossible. In such circumstances, the reset would not erase humanity. It would redefine what humanity could remember. After a reset, cultures tend to favour resilience over complexity, oral transmission over written, myth over record, mobility over monument. These choices are not regressions. They are strategies. They preserve what matters most when conditions are unstable. Only once stability returns does complexity re-emerge. This pattern appears repeatedly in the archaeological record. Periods of consolidation follow periods of dispersion. Tools become simpler, they're more specialized again. Settlement density fluctuates. These shifts are often described as evolutionary stages, but stages imply direction. Resets imply necessity. A reset does not move history forward or backward. It moves it sideways. If Antarctica played a role in a previous configuration of the world, climatic, symbolic, or geographic, its loss would have required such a sideways movement. The systems built around it would no longer function. New systems would need to emerge elsewhere, built from what remained intact. This would not produce amnesia. It would produce selective memory. Certain ideas would survive because they could be carried anywhere. Concepts of order, cycles of time, relationships between sky and land. Others would vanish because they depended on specific places that no longer mattered. The result would be cultures that feel ancient and new at the same time, rooted yet aware of loss, confident in practice, uncertain in origin. This duality persists in early civilizations. They speak of first kings who were not first, of knowledge given by predecessors, of ages that ended before memory began. These are not the stories of people inventing themselves. They are the stories of people resuming after interruption. Modern thought resists this interpretation because it destabilizes progress. It suggests that advancement is not cumulative, that what is gained can be lost without warning, that civilization is less a ladder than a rhythm. Antarctica embodies this rhythm in physical form. Its ice expands and retreats according to cycles beyond human control. Its habitability is not permanent. It participates in the world, then withdraws from it. If this withdrawal coincided with a broader climatic realignment, the resulting reset would not be singular, it would be systemic. The world that emerged afterward would not know what it had lost. It would only know what it could rebuild. This reframes the question of origins once again. Instead of asking where civilization began, one must ask how often it has begun again. How many times humans have been forced to reconstruct order from fragments, unaware that they were not starting from zero. The discomfort here lies not in speculation, but in humility. It requires accepting that our position in history may not be privileged, that we're not necessarily closer to the beginning or the end, but somewhere within a repeating process. Resets do not demand catastrophe, they demand imbalance. When the environment changes faster than social systems can adapt, resets occur. When reference points disappear, orientation must be rebuilt. When memory loses context, meaning compresses. Antarctica's role in this process may be subtle, but it is consistent. Its transformation represents a loss that could not be negotiated with. A place removed so completely that it forced recalibration elsewhere. This does not require that Antarctica was the original centre of civilization in a literal sense. It requires only that it was part of a configuration that no longer exists. Its removal would have contributed to the need for reorganization. Seen this way, the rise of later civilizations is not miraculous. It is inevitable. Given enough survivors, enough time and enough pressure, humans will always rebuild. They will impose order. They will stabilize. They will tell stories that make sense of what remains. What they will not do is remember what cannot be revisited. Resets ensure that beginnings are always partial, that origins are reconstructed from endpoints, that certainty grows as distance from disruption increases. This may explain why the idea of a final reset feels implausible, because resets do not feel final, they feel survivable. They feel like adaptation rather than collapse. Antarctica, still frozen, still withdrawn, reminds us that not all losses announce themselves. Some simply remain inaccessible long enough for new certainties to form around their absence. If civilization has been reset before, not once but multiple times, then the question is not whether another reset will occur. The question is how much of what we believe to be foundational would survive it, and whether, after enough time has passed, those survivors would mistake what remains for the beginning once again. At the edge of the map, there is a silence that does not ask to be broken. Antarctica remains there, not as a conclusion, not as a revelation, but as a presence that resists integration. It does not resolve the question of origins, it complicates it. And in that complication, something essential begins to surface. Human history prefers foundations that can be pointed to, a river you can stand beside, a ruin you can touch, a layer you can date. These things create confidence. They suggest continuity. They imply that what exists now emerged naturally from what came before. Antarctica offers none of this comfort. It is real, measurable, immense, yet functionally absent from lived human experience. Its scale is undeniable, its influence global, and its role in shaping climate unquestioned. And yet, when it comes to human memory, it appears as a blank. Blanks are unsettling not because they hide answers, but because they expose assumptions. Throughout this journey, Antarctica has not behaved like a lost city or a hidden archive waiting to be uncovered. It has behaved like a boundary, one that separates what can be remembered from what cannot be returned to. Its ice does not conceal a single truth. It enforces a condition, inaccessibility long enough for certainty to reorganize itself elsewhere. If there was once a configuration of the world in which Antarctica mattered differently, climatically, symbolically, structurally, its disappearance would not register as a dramatic event in history. It would register as a slow drift into forgetfulness. A forgetting that feels natural because it is total. What cannot be revisited is eventually reimagined. This is how myths form. This is how origins simplify. This is how absence becomes normal. The question of whether Antarctica was the original centre of human civilization may never be answered definitively. Not because the answer is forbidden, but because the conditions required to verify it no longer exist. Ice has erased access without erasing consequence. But perhaps the value of the question lies elsewhere. To ask it seriously is to confront the fragility of historical certainty, to recognize that what we call beginnings may be shaped more by survival than by sequence, that the places we identify as cradles may be refuges rather than sources. Antarctica forces a shift in perspective. It asks whether history is something that accumulates, or something that is periodically rearranged by forces indifferent to human narrative. If centers can disappear, then origins are provisional. If climates can change faster than cultures can adapt, then memory is not guaranteed. And if knowledge can fragment without intent, then certainty itself becomes suspect, not as false, but as incomplete. There is a quiet warning embedded in this realization. Civilization often assumes permanence where there is only stability for now. It builds institutions, archives, and identities as though the conditions that support them are fixed. Antarctica stands as a reminder that entire regions can exit the human world without conflict, without drama, simply by becoming inhospitable. No empire needs to fall for a center to vanish. No library needs to burn for knowledge to lose context. It only needs to become unreachable. In this sense, Antarctica is not about the past alone. It is about orientation, about how easily the present mistakes accessibility for importance, about how confidently it assigns beginnings to what remains visible. The ice does not argue, it does not insist, it does not reveal, it waits. Perhaps this is the most unsettling aspect of all. That the planet carries memories we no longer have the means to interpret. That parts of our story may be locked not behind secrecy, but behind physics, behind cold, behind time. If humanity has reorganized itself once after losing a center, it can do so again. And if it does, future histories will be written from what survives, not from what mattered most. They will point to new origins, new cradles, new beginnings, and somewhere beyond their reach, another silence may remain, unmapped, inaccessible, and slowly becoming irrelevant through familiarity. Antarctica does not need to be proven central to unsettle us. Its role is already complete in a different way. It stands as evidence that the world can change faster than stories can follow. That certainty is a function of access. That memory, once disconnected from place, becomes something else entirely. In the end, the question is not whether Antarctica was the first centre of civilization. The question is whether any centre can be trusted to remain one, and whether, as we move forward, confident in our archives, our maps, our narratives, we're paying attention to the quiet places where the world is already beginning to withdraw.